In this video, I'm going to demo wedging, which is very important in creating a homogeneous mass without any air bubbles. And air bubbles are really detrimental to pots because it could pop and burst and make holes in your work during the firing process, or when you're throwing on the wheel you can get some resistance and it could throw you off the pot, so it's not centered anymore. And so making sure you remove all the air bubbles before you get started with your piece is very important. And so I have a chunk of clay here that's been reclaimed, so it's been reworked, so it was chunks of bone dry clay at one point, and then it got re-soaked with water. It's slaked in water, and then you kind of let that water evaporate as this sits and creates a clay slurry that slowly starts to congeal a little bit more, and then you got this really sloppy wet clay that you can take and put onto canvas or plaster or terracotta boards. There's kind of different ways of drying out your sloppy clay, and then like covering the top with plastic or canvas to kind of slowly allow it to dry, and then you kind of get it back into working condition. But here's the chunk, and so there's basically two main methods for wedging, and then there's also a thing called wire wedging, which is especially helpful in if you're kind of wanting to mix two different kinds of clays and make like a throw on the wheel with those two different kinds of clay and have swirls in your pots and cylinders that you make. It can look really nice with the two contrasting clay colors working together. But so I'm just gonna start with the ram's head, and first you kind of, this might be a little too much for beginner, and like if you have wrist issues, you can always use smaller amounts to wedge with at first, and then like slam the pieces of clay together to kind of make it into one big lump. It depends on how big your work's going to be that you're throwing on the wheel or sculpting with from the beginning. But so basically, nice to kind of get it into a manageable size, but I thought I would use this amount because it'd be easier to kind of demonstrate the way my hand is pressing on the work. But if you can kind of see, there's already an air bubble right here, and I don't know if this camera's sound is good enough, but sometimes when I'm wedging I could actually hear the bubbles within the clay popping out, so that's kind of always fun. And important thing with before starting is of course like thinking about your posture, your body. The height of the table really matters on how easy it is without harming your back on the wedging. And you want a very clean surface to wedge on. You don't want to wedge on crusty clay because then you'll get all those little chunks in your nice wet clay, and it's gonna make it very hard for you to work with your clay, especially if you're throwing. But so basically kind of, you see how I'm holding it to the side. I'm gonna start close here. I like to kind of stand with one leg in the front, one leg in the back, and spread it a little bit, almost like I'm gonna take a sprint, because then I can use the whole upper body to press into it, not just my wrists, and kind of go like this and yeah, you don't want to try to like bend your wrist too much. So, I mean, do what's comfortable for you. Just think about the longevity of your body. So, kind of see, this is the ram's head. You can kind of tell where that name comes from. You can start to see kind of how it's forming in, especially when it's a big chunk like this. You want to kind of hold it in from the sides and push, and you want to have a little rocking motion. You see that's an air bubble that's already starting to pop, and you know, you can scooch it a little bit and press and press, rocking it and pressing it using your upper body and arm all kind of in one motion. Okay. Yep, I just heard a bubble pop. Oh, another one. And at the bottom you can see kind of where they're starting to pop. Okay, like this. What you don't want to do is push all the way like this and then fold it in, because that just trapped more bubble right there, bubbles. And so like, you don't want to do the fold. Definitely want to do the rocking and gently, and you know, if you need to, you can kind of slam it back down and readjust and bring it up front, roll it back gently. And see, these are all locations that used to have bubble that the clay's kind of getting rotated. And this, you know, ram's head method, oh, that was a big one. That's probably what got folded in. The ram's head method is a really good wedging for like a really bubble and clay that needs to be worked a lot. And so kind of want to do this. Definitely at least 30 times minimum. But you, fresh clay that comes from the factory that's bagged, they kind of is extruded out of a pug mill, so all the air bubbles are removed already before they get bagged, so you don't have to really wedge a lot. But when you have your own studio and you're using reclaimed clay, which is clay that is being recycled after it's been bone dry and broken up into little pieces and turned back into slip and then another into a workable condition, but I can still, there's still like extra wrinkles where the bubbles are, so I know I have more work to do. You can tell this is a really good exercise, and a good upper body workout. And you know, I'm kind of bending my left knee that's in front of me, helping my body kind of rock back and forth. And it's but this is a very, very important step, especially if you're throwing on the wheel. Now, if you're hand building, it's not too big of a problem, but you definitely don't want air bubbles in your work. Like I said in the beginning, it can and most likely will explode in the kiln. Any trapped air expands, and depending on the thickness of the piece and where the bubble is located, you will get a big chip in your pot, or it could crack and lead to bigger problems. But basically, clay that's been compressed better is stronger in its final form. And you know, it's really obvious when I take clay that's been wedged really well, let it get bone dry, and try to break it. It's very strong, and it takes some force to break it into chunks. But if there's any kind of loose air bubbles in a bone dry piece, that becomes the weak spot, and it breaks right there. It could just be a little what you call it, little bump, and it breaks. Also, this was a reclaim, and I just found a piece of staple in my clay. So be careful if you guys are recycling clay, what you're throwing into the recyclable bin. This looks like it came from a piece of paper, or maybe it was in like a, what do you call it, advertisement newspaper, but it looks like it got stuck in somebody's work that got recycled, and this stuff kind of causes big problems too. So, keep wedging, and it's starting to look good and feel good. Also, wedging is a good way to remove excessive moisture if your clay seems a little wet, and everybody has different preferences on how stiff they like their clay when they throw. I like mine a little on the softer side on the wheel because it's just a lot easier on my wrists and hand. But okay, I think we got a pretty good ram's head going on here. And let's see, look at that. Okay, and from here, I think I'll just move onto spiral wedging, which I like better for my wheel throwing objects because of the way it kind of creates a cone shape to it, which is easier to kind of like plop onto the wheel in shape than ram's head, where I have to like pound it and form it into more of a manageable shape for throwing on the wheel. So for spiral wedging, I take my left hand, and you know, if you're left or right-handed, you can switch depending on what's more comfortable to you, but take my left hand and kind of support this on the side, and then on my right, this is kind of where I like lift up and bring down, and lift up, bring down, lift up, bring down, and you know, I'm using my left hand kind of as a support. And of course, if you need to readjust, there's a little more rocking involved, you do that, but and then kind of start shaping it into a cone. And then here, when I kind of get it to the form I like, then this hand's really starting to guide the pushing of it, as well as this left hand, and you can kind of, you know, hold it, rock it. And the same thing goes with this spiral wedging. You don't want to push it till you get a flat spot and then fold it. It's all about that rocking motion, that you kind of slowly move the clay in a spiral rotation. Even with the ram's head, it's rotating the clay, and so you can kind of tell what's happening over here. And you don't want a hole like this to happen, so Just want to make sure you work that out a little better than I just created, I think, demo purposes. But so kind of work it in, rock it on an angle, and so when you have a piece like this, then you can kind of plop it on the wheel this way. You kind of slam it down, and then on the wheel you can cone up and down, center it, and work with it. Okay. And then the third wedging method of the wire wedging. So I'm starting to get a little crusty on my hands, so I'm gonna kind of get rid of that on a wet sponge. And then if you have wet hands and you touch wet clay, it really does make it slippery and hard to work, so dry your hands off. A little towel is always really helpful in the clay studio. Okay, and so wire wedging, it's pretty basic. So we're just doing it with one kind of clay, and I'm just showing you an example of how to kind of do it. But wire wedging is when you take your clay, if you have two pieces of different clay to make a little swirl, then it works really nicely. But okay, so far this looks good. I did a cut, and there's no air bubbles in here that you can see, so that's really good. We've wedged all that out nicely. But for spiral wedging, that worked nice. And then for wire wedging, basically it's just a method of cutting the clay and then slamming two pieces of clay together really hard, and then basically depends on kind of how you want your swirl to show up, and so like you can kind of keep track of how you want to kind of layer it and slam it. So basically you just slam it together, and you continue this process, let's see, like definitely 20 times to get like a nice swirl in the clay with different contrast in the layers. And if you do it like 30 or a little more, then you kind of get a uniform clay that has the mix of one and the second color. So it just shows like more you wedge, the better homogeneous clump of clay you have to work with. Okay, and so so what was this method of wedging called? Okay, ram's head. All right, that was easy. And this. All right. Making a spiral, so spiral wedging. And then where you just slam your clays together. That's wire wedging. Okay, so those are your three main wedging techniques.